Greetings, class. Dr. Larson, thank you for taking the time to listen to me this evening. This evening, I'm going to be talking about how we can regain valuable biodiversity here in the Cumberland River in Nashville. Before I get into specifics about that, I want to talk to you about what biodiversity loss is. And to do that, we've got to first talk about biodiversity. And so really, there's three key elements to biodiversity. The first is species diversity, and that is the number of different organisms from the microscopic all the way up to the megafauna and every species in between. That represents species diversity. Within each species, there's genetic diversity. A healthy population has a broad range of genes within it, and so when they reproduce, there's less chance of mutation or faulty genes or poor gene expression. The healthier population, the better that genetic diversity is within that population. Again, that's specific to an individual species. And then finally, we have ecosystem diversity or habitat diversity, depending on how you look at it. Really, I guess an ecosystem occupies a habitat, or multiple ecosystems can occupy a habitat. But the range and number of those different ecosystems represents ecosystem diversity. When we talk about the loss in biodiversity, if you had a significant loss of any one of these elements, you're talking about biodiversity loss. And I would argue that in today's world, we're faced with the loss of all three in pretty much every ecosystem in the world, unfortunately. And so that's what we're looking at in terms of the loss of biodiversity. What does it mean to lose biodiversity? Really, I see three kind of key areas in terms of losses. The first one's valuable genetic material. The story that I'll tell is about the thylacine, more commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger. There's a lot of talk about cloning that species, that animal, bringing it back to life. The people that are, I guess, not opposed but calling out the risk are saying that the animal could never survive. And the reason for that isn't because of the technology they're using to clone and replicate the genes. The reason for that is there's no thylacine mother, and the biome, the gut biome with that animal is gone, and there's no way to restore it. And so just think about that for a minute. The entire microbial ecosystem that lived within that animal and was passed down from mother to pup no longer exists. And they don't believe that they can recreate it or get close enough to it to give the animal a chance to survive. So think about the value of that genetic material that no longer exists. And so when we wipe out a species, we're wiping out everything within that species. And I don't know of a way to quantify that. We don't even know what was in that animal, the thylacine that we've lost. The next thing we'll talk about is redundancy protections. So when you look at, for example, pollination of food crops, that there's not a lot of redundancy there. We're talking about honeybees as the major pollinator. There's not a ton of other species that can do that job. We're losing them at an alarming rate. And so when you don't have biodiversity, you're reliant on one species. There's huge risk with that. And that, I'm sure there's tens and hundreds of other examples that you could bring up that talk about that redundancy risk. And that's part of what we're losing when we lose biodiversity. And the last one is a bit less tangible. I think we're losing our souls. The example that I always give is I don't want to go out into the wilderness, into the forest, and have it be just like a park, empty. I don't want to swim in the ocean and have it be like a swimming pool. I understand there's risk of wildlife encounters, but part of that is what makes you feel alive. To see some other sentient, functioning animal that's not another human is revitalizing, I think, to most people, and that's what we lose when we lose biodiversity. When we talk about it in a more local sense, I'll start with first sort of what's driving it here in the Cumberland watershed, and this is probably true of 70 or 80% of the areas that we talk about, which is water pollution, habitat fragmentation through dams and property development, and then on a more macro level, climate change, where warming temperatures not only makes the water maybe too warm at some times of the year, but just the volatility of the weather is just, you can see the increase, and that can have a drastic effect when you have major flooding. You can't control what gets pushed into the river in terms of pollutants, runoff, bank erosion, certain types of grasses that can only grow at a certain depth get wiped out because the the level changes so quickly. Fish spawn where they need just the right amount of sunlight to reach the eggs, and if the water goes down too much or up too much, their spawn is shot for that season. We talk about species affected by this more broadly in Tennessee. There's currently 93 species on the endangered species list. More specifically to the Cumberland River system, that includes the pallid sturgeon, the Nashville crayfish, 5 darterfish, and 5 species of mussels, with 17 already extirpated in the area. I'm sure there's other species, perhaps that we haven't even identified yet, that are endangered, and we don't even know about them, and perhaps species we think are safe may also be under threat. 2/3 of the world's rivers, when we talk about these challenges not being specific just to Nashville, 2/3 of the world's rivers are interrupted by some form of dam. This affects the river's course, the river flows, how the current works, where silt builds up, how organisms are able to migrate through the system, if at all, the depth and the temperature of the water. All of these impact those species' ability to survive and thrive within the ecosystem, and in certain instances opens it up to invasive species and changes the environment enough where those species have a competitive advantage. Some of the big drivers here locally, population of the Nashville metro area has grown from 775,000 roughly in 2001 all the way to 1.2 or over 1.2 million here by 2021, and still growing. It was in 1887 the first lock and dam was built on the river. By 1900 there had been 14 total dams on the Cumberland and its tributaries, and today now the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates 10 dams on the system. Well, who cares? So when we talk about improving the water quality of the Cumberland River, increasing biodiversity, protecting what we haven't lost yet, who cares, or who I think should care? That's me on the left with a beautiful smallmouth for the Cumberland. I do think the end users of the system, the recreational users, care a lot about the species that they have access to interact with in some way, shape, or form. It's really the remit of the state and local government to provide clean water, provide fish harvest that won't kill you or poison you, protect the land and water resources for future generations, protect the harvest, and the world. This will be a bit of a common reframe throughout the presentation, but if you were to enact real solutions here on the Cumberland River and prove those successes, there's many, many, many places in the world in a similar circumstance that would look to the people that put that in place, and they'd be heroes. How did you do it? What worked? Please help us. We want to do the same thing. It's an opportunity to lead and not just sit back and see what happens. And so if you do it right, I think the world cares. So in terms of my solution, and there's a few things, 3 things I'll be proposing in terms of things that can be done. The number one target audience would be the state government. They are effectively the buyer. They sign the check. They're going to fund any new dam that gets built. They also provide funding for the operation of the existing dams. We talk about the different ways to approach them at the end of this slide. The same goes for the Army Corps of Engineers, where with my software background, I see them as the end user of the technology that might be proposed as part of the solution. They're going to run the dam day to day. So whether you're putting in new technology or even putting forward process changes to improve things, they have to enact it and manage it day to day. And then the end users, not of the dam, but of the system. So stakeholder support from the commercial users, those barge operators that do a huge amount of commercial transit on the river, the recreational fishermen, the commercial fishermen, the fishing guides, all of those end users would be not directly for a sale of a solution, but in terms of a campaign to garner support, to get a groundswell. You'd want as many of those people on board as you could, and things you'd be talking about, or I'll be talking about with them, would be the importance of conserving valuable species. The ROI, when we talk about new technology, we've been doing the same thing with dams that we have for the last 100 years, which is poke a hole in it and put a ladder for the fish to swim up and down. And that technology hasn't changed in 100 years, but there's many new ways to do it now. There's some great new solutions out there, and the ROI around that is the fact that when you don't have to poke a hole in your dam, you gain roughly 10% hydroelectricity output. And so you are able to put out more electricity because there's more pressure on that dam, more water flowing through the dam because you don't need to poke a hole in it. Simple physics. The value of species that can be maintained and perhaps find haven, or potentially the increase in genetic diversity within the system. We talked about increased power generation, the fact that it applies worldwide, how you could be seen as a leader and a hero, and really enhance your reputation and your career by doing something meaningful. Before I talk about the recommended, management practices, or the recommended changes to enact, we'll talk about the past management, and we talk about broadly the environmental management practices. From, the Industrial Revolution onwards, it was really a top-down worldview where humanity's dominion over nature was just assumed. It was a very short-term type of thinking. It was really only ever measured by the immediacy of the resources that could be harvested. The sustainability of even the resource that's coming out wasn't considered. It was move on to the next one. So if you're dropping a giant trawler net that just strips the cod fishery completely of its ability to reproduce, you just move on to the next fishery. You don't worry about making the one you're in sustainable. And as a result, we're seeing the collapse of fisheries, the collapse of things where that approach has been taken. The good news is, I think, the awareness of our impact, the impact of processes like that, is increased exponentially. And so around the 80s and 90s, as driven by that awareness, there was more of an adaptive co-management model where it was more of a bottoms-up type approach where the local stakeholders were involved. And the idea was to take the knowledge and learnings from the management and put it back into the process, improve the process, make it adaptable, iterative, to continually improve. And so I think the current model, or the most advanced model today, is a social ecological system, SES for short. I think the key points around SES are that it's cross-disciplinary, so various forms of data and science are taken into account. It is data-driven, but it's also driven theoretically. It's really trying to do a good job in framing the complex relationship between humans and the ecosystems in which they live and how they interact. It acknowledges that complexity and the interconnectedness of everything. And a good example of this, here's a frame